Today, we are digging into the wild origin story of our modern material world. I mean, we are surrounded by plastics, right? But their history isn't just a chemistry lesson. It's this amazing story of scarcity, invention, and the huge economic forces that literally shaped the stuff of our lives. Okay, let's get into it.
So, to start, I want you to just think about this number. 460 million tons. That's the estimate for global plastics production just for this year. To put that in perspective, back in 1950, it was only about 1.5 million tons. The scale today is it's staggering.
So, a simple question, right? Where did it all come from? But the answer is totally counterintuitive. To really get the plastic age, we have to go back to a time when our world wasn't defined by having all these man-made materials, but by a major shortage of natural ones.
Yeah, that's right. The whole plastics industry didn't start with the abundance of oil we think of today. Nope. It was born out of the complete opposite, a serious resource scarcity in the 19th century. The first big push for synthetic material, it all came from the hunt for a substitute for elephant tusks. Okay, so picture the Industrial Revolution going full steam. Factories are just pumping out goods. But here's the catch. They completely relied on materials they had to harvest from nature, things like tortoiseshell, horn, and especially ivory. The problem? You can't scale nature on demand. The world was staring down a massive supply chain crisis. And the biggest crisis by far was ivory. It was the material for everything from fancy billiard balls and piano keys to the handles on your everyday cutlery. But by the 1860s, the hunt for ivory had devastated global elephant populations, and prices had shot through the roof. They were completely unsustainable. This created this huge economic incentive, a real pressure cooker, to invent a replacement. And this is where things get really interesting, because you can see the huge difference between just a scientific discovery and a real industrial breakthrough. You know, people have been tinkering around with new materials for a while, but it took a very specific commercial prize to turn a lab curiosity into a product that would change the world. This contrast really tells the whole story. So, in 1862, you have Alexander Parks, who shows off Parkasine, the world's first thermoplastic. It was a cool invention, a marvel even, but it was flawed, expensive, and it just didn't take off. Fast forward 6 years, John Wesley Hyatt comes along. Now, he wasn't just messing around in a lab, he was chasing a $10,000 prize offered by a billiard company. By adding camphor to a similar mix, he stabilized it and created celluloid, the very first commercially successful plastic.
And here is the crucial point. Celluloid was a game changer because it could mimic expensive natural stuff. All of a sudden, things like combs, fancy buttons, and shirt collars, items that were once only for the rich, could be mass-produced for the growing middle class. This was the very beginning of the democratization of stuff.
But you know, inventing the material, that was only half the battle. You couldn't just take this new goo and use the old machines. To really kickstart the plastic age, they had to invent a completely new way of manufacturing right alongside the material itself. And here is the absolutely brilliant solution. In 1872, John Wesley Hyatt and his brother patented the first ever injection molding machine. Just think of it like a giant hypodermic needle. It would heat up the celluloid, and then a huge plunger would force that molten material into a mold. And get this, that basic principle, forcing hot plastic into a closed shape, is still the foundation of how we process plastics today. It was brilliant, but it was far from perfect. See, the thermodynamics were a real headache. Plastic is a terrible conductor of heat, so the outside layer next to the hot cylinder walls would literally burn, while the stuff in the middle was still cold and solid. This laminar flow problem, as they called it, meant the machine could only make small, thin things like buttons and combs. Anything bigger was a total no-go. Okay, so if celluloid was the prologue, then the first real chapter of the modern plastic age kicks off at the turn of the 20th century. A whole new industrial revolution, electrification, was creating a brand new kind of scarcity, and that demanded an even better material. Now, to get this next leap, you have to understand this one key difference. Celluloid was a thermoplastic. You could melt it and remold it again and again, kind of like wax. The next big invention, Bakelite, was a thermoset. Once you heated it and molded it, a chemical change happened that was irreversible. It's set permanently. Think of it like baking a cake. You can't turn the cake back into batter. So what was the problem this time around? Well, it was a shortage of shellac.
That's a natural resin that comes from an insect, and it was the go-to material for insulating all the new electrical components. The race was on to find a synthetic shellac, and that's what led a Belgian chemist named Leo Baekeland to his lab in New York. And this table just sums up the huge leap perfectly. While celluloid was semi-synthetic, a modified natural product, Baekeland's invention in 1907 was the first fully synthetic plastic, made from things like coal tar. And unlike celluloid, which was all about looking like ivory or tortoiseshell, Bakelite was all about industrial performance. It was tough, heat-resistant, non-conductive, perfect for the electrical age. And here's the thing, Baekeland wasn't just a brilliant chemist, he was an absolutely brilliant businessman. He filed for a patent right away, formed a company, and then systematically merged with his rivals to consolidate the whole industry. He created the first real plastics giant and wrote the business playbook for the chemical sector for the next 100 years. Invent something new, protect it with patents, and control the market. So there you have it. These two foundational inventions, one born from a billiard ball prize, the other from the needs of the electrical age, they laid down the entire blueprint for what would become the polymer century. They solved the problem of scarcity by creating entirely new materials that could be made on demand. Let's just quickly recap this incredible journey. It starts with the scientific curiosity in 1862. Then a commercially viable product in 1868, followed by the machine to actually make things with it in 1872. Then we get the huge leap to a fully synthetic, industrial-grade material in 1907. But it wasn't until the 1930s that the final piece of the early puzzle, extrusion, which lets you make continuous things like pipes and films, was perfected. That really set the stage for the massive explosion that was about to come.
So how on earth did an event that we define by tanks and planes and armies end up creating the very material that's in your phone right now, your car, your keyboard? It's this incredible story of chemistry, of crisis, and of a series of wild gambles that, for better or worse, completely reshaped our planet. To really get it, you have to rewind the clock back to the late 1930s. The world is on a knife's edge, about to plunge into war. And leaders were realizing that this coming fight wouldn't just be about soldiers, it was going to be a war of materials, a brutal battle for the raw ingredients you need to build a modern military machine. The big fear, the idea that kept generals awake at night, was this concept called autarky. Basically, it's the idea that to survive a war, a nation had to be completely self-sufficient. Because if your enemy could set up a naval blockade, they could literally starve your factories of resources, crippling your entire war effort without ever firing a shot. And the Allied powers? They were incredibly vulnerable. Their lifelines stretched all across the globe. They needed silk from Asia to make parachutes. They needed massive amounts of rubber from Southeast Asia for every single tire and tank tread. They even needed pig bristles from Russia for all sorts of industrial brushes. If any of those supply lines were cut, they were in huge trouble. And that brings us to our first breakthrough material, nylon. And this wasn't just some fashion innovation, it was a massive strategic bet, placed years before the war even started, all to solve a huge national dependency. The mission here was just staggering. The chemical giant DuPont basically said, we are going to invent a completely new synthetic fiber using only stuff we can find right here at home: coal, air, and water. And the goal wasn't just to replace Japanese silk, it was to create something even better.
And they really put their money where their mouth was. I mean, look at this number, $27 million. In 1938, that's in the middle of the Great Depression. It was a colossal sum of money, an absolutely massive gamble on a technology that was completely unproven.
And to put that risk into perspective for you, that one investment, that one factory, represented 1/6 of the company's entire net income for the year. Can you imagine a company today betting that much of its profit on one single radical idea? It was a total all-in move. And then the war breaks out. Nylon's whole destiny changes in an instant. That plant in Delaware, the one built to make stockings, it was immediately taken over by the military. It started running 24/7, pumping out this new wonder fiber, not for fashion, but for the essential tools of war: parachutes, bomber tires, mosquito netting. The consumer dream became a strategic weapon, literally overnight. Okay, so nylon was this deliberate, high-stakes research project. Our next material, though, was a complete and total accident.
But it was a happy accident that would go on to become one of the most important secret weapons of the entire war.
So picture this. It's 1933, and chemists over at Imperial Chemical Industries, or ICI, in the UK are running this experiment under insane pressure. But something went wrong, the equipment failed, and when they opened up the chamber, they found this weird, waxy, white stuff inside. They had no clue, but they had just accidentally discovered polyethylene.
And here's the craziest part of the story. The secret ingredient was the failure itself. There was a tiny leak in their high-pressure vessel, and it let a minuscule amount of oxygen seep into the chamber. Well, that little bit of oxygen was the accidental catalyst that magically turned the ethylene gas into a solid. If that leak hadn't happened, they might never have discovered it. So why was this waxy solid such a big deal? Well, it turned out to be the perfect electrical insulator for high-frequency cables. And what that meant was you could finally build radar systems that were light and small enough to fit inside an airplane. This material became a top state secret, and it gave Allied pilots a massive technological advantage in the air. You know, this quote right here just says it all. The big tech arms race of World War II wasn't just about rockets and jet engines. A critical and honestly often overlooked part of the Allied advantage was rooted in their mastery of these brand new synthetic materials. But the most dramatic story, the real crisis point for the entire war effort, was the frantic race for synthetic rubber. I mean, this wasn't about gaining an edge anymore. This was about preventing total and utter defeat. A modern army runs on rubber, and the Allies were about to lose pretty much all of it. Just let that number sink in for a second. 90%. In 1942, when Japan took over Southeast Asia, 90% of the American rubber supply was cut off. Just like that. Gone. No rubber for tires, for gaskets, for tank treads. The entire Allied war machine was about to grind to a halt. The response was absolutely monumental. The US government launched a crash program, pouring in $700 million, that's over $13 billion today, to create a synthetic rubber industry from scratch. They forced fierce corporate rivals, companies that hated each other, to pull their patents and work together for the good of the nation. And the result of all that effort? It's a sheer vertical climb. Look at this. In 1941, the US produced a tiny, negligible amount of synthetic rubber. By 1945, over 750,000 tons. It is honestly one of the most incredible feats of industrial mobilization in all of history. They didn't just build factories, they built an entire industry from the ground up in less than 4 years. So the war ends. The world is now flooded with this incredible new capacity to make all these synthetic materials. But a totally new problem pops up. The science of creating the plastics had raced way ahead of the technology for actually shaping them into useful things. Yeah, the old injection molding machines, which were the workhorses of the early plastics industry, they just couldn't handle these new, more sensitive materials. They were slow, they were inefficient, they heated the plastic all unevenly. It created this huge production bottleneck that was stopping these miracle materials from actually reaching the mass market. And this slide just illustrates the solution so perfectly. In 1946, an American inventor named James Watson Hendry comes up with something called the reciprocating screw. So instead of just ramming the plastic forward like a plunger, his design used a rotating screw that kind of churned and melted the material perfectly evenly. This one idea solved all the old problems, it made production way faster, and you could even mix vibrant colors right in the machine. This single invention was the key. It was the thing that unlocked the modern plastic age. It made mass production so fast and so cheap that the whole idea of disposability became economically possible for the very first time. And its legacy is just incredible. 95% of all modern injection molding machines are still based on that same fundamental principle. It's a huge question. Think about it. Water bottles, food containers, packaging. How did we get to a point where nearly everything we buy is designed to be thrown away? Well, we're going to unpack that. We'll dig into the key moments, the crucial inventions, and the economic shocks that made it all happen. And the scale of this change, it's just hard to wrap your head around. In just 50 years, plastic production grew by over 13,000%. We're talking from 1.5 million tons in 1950 to over 200 million by the year 2000. This wasn't just growth, it was a complete and total transformation of our material world.
All right, so let's rewind the clock. Our story really kicks off right after World War II. The world was rebuilding, and a brand new consumer society was just hungry for new products. This created the absolute perfect storm for what we call the petrochemical boom.
And this right here, this was the game changer. See, before the war, the chemical industry pretty much ran on coal. But afterwards, it switched to a feedstock that was way cheaper and way more abundant: oil and natural gas. That single change, just shifting the basic building block, is what made everything that followed possible.
And, this is a classic swords to plowshares kind of story. You had these massive industrial plants that had been cranking out things like nitrates for barns or polyethylene to insulate radar cables, and suddenly the war is over, and they're just sitting there, ready to go. So they were retooled and pointed in a new direction, not towards war, but towards churning out an incredible variety of stuff for you and me. So, okay, you've got the raw material, but that's only half the battle, right? You need the right technology to actually shape it into useful things. And plastic's first big win came when it went head-to-head with glass in the packaging market. The key technology here was something called blow molding. The idea is actually pretty simple. You take a hot, soft tube of plastic, stick it inside a mold, and then inflate it, kind of like blowing up a balloon. It pushes out against the walls of the mold, and just like that, you've got a hollow container. And what's so cool about this is that it wasn't some brand new idea pulled out of thin air. The whole process was directly inspired by the ancient art of glass blowing. It's just a classic example of taking an old idea and applying it to a revolutionary new material. And boy, did this technology take off fast. In the late 40s, the first real hit was a squeeze bottle for deodorant, made from a flexible plastic called low-density polyethylene, or LDPE. Then, just a few years later in the 50s, chemists discovered a stiffer, stronger version, high-density polyethylene, HDPE. By the 60s, these new HDPE jugs were kicking heavy glass bottles to the curb for things like bleach and detergent. The revolution was officially on. But just as things were really hitting their stride, the entire industry, which had tied its whole future to cheap oil, was about to run headfirst into a brick wall. The 1970s brought an oil crisis that threatened its very existence. So, in 1973, you have the OPEC oil embargo, and the price of crude oil just explodes. We're talking it quadrupled almost overnight, from around $3 a barrel to 12. For an industry that was built from the ground up on cheap oil derivatives, this was a full-blown catastrophe. This quote just says it all. The cost basis of the industry evaporated overnight. Can you imagine? The cheap raw material that their entire business model was built on? Poof, it was suddenly gone. Decades of falling prices were shattered in an instant. But here's the crazy part. This crisis, it didn't kill the plastics industry. Nope, it actually did the opposite. It forced it to get smarter. Scarcity became the mother of invention, and it sparked this incredible new wave of innovation that was all about one thing: efficiency. So the new mission, the new mandate for every engineer in the industry was dead simple. The cost of plastic resin was through the roof, so the goal was simple: figure out how to make the exact same products, but use less plastic. And one of the most brilliant solutions they came up with was this thing called gas-assisted injection molding. Here's how it works. First, you inject the melted plastic. But then, and this is the clever part, you inject a shot of nitrogen gas. The gas creates these hollow channels inside the part. So what's the result? You get a part that's just as strong, but way lighter. And you save a ton of that expensive material. And they also came up with other really clever tech, like these vented extruders. Now, this might sound boring, but it was a huge deal. It basically meant factories could start using lower quality and therefore much cheaper plastics, and even recycled stuff, without having to do this whole expensive and time-consuming pre-drying step. It was all about doing more with less. So the reaction to the oil crisis wasn't just about new technology. It was also about geography. Starting around the 1980s, the whole center of gravity for the plastics industry began to shift away from its traditional home in the West, and it started moving east. I mean, look at these numbers. The shift was absolutely dramatic. In 1950, Asia produced less than 5% of the world's plastic. Fast forward to the year 2000, and its share had exploded to 35%. This was a massive relocation of an entire global industry. So you gotta ask, why? Why did this happen? Well, it boils down to a few key things. First, you had booming industries in Japan, like cars and electronics, that needed huge amounts of precision plastic parts. Second, Japanese companies were pioneering these hyper-efficient, all-electric machines that used a lot less energy. And finally, you had the rise of the four Asian tigers, who were basically becoming the world's new workshop, ready to pump out commodity goods on a massive scale. And the result of all this? A total explosion. Fueled mostly by all this new capacity being built in Asia, global plastic production more than tripled just between 1980 and 2000. Just incredible. Okay, so this brings us to the final piece of the puzzle. We've got the cheap material, we've got the global manufacturing base. Now we just need the one last technology that truly, finally cemented our single-use culture. And that technology is called thermoforming. It's actually a pretty simple idea, but it's super, super fast. You take a thin sheet of plastic, you heat it up so it gets soft and floppy, and then you use a vacuum to suck it down into a mold. I want you to think of every blister pack, every yogurt cup, every clear plastic clamshell container you've ever seen. That's thermoforming.
And really, this was it. This was the capstone innovation. It was so cheap and so fast that it suddenly made economic sense to package literally everything, from a single sandwich to a couple of batteries, in its own little disposable plastic container. This is what truly unlocked the age of disposability.
So let's kick things off with a little puzzle. What on earth could a spinal implant possibly have in common with a state-of-the-art jet engine? Well, the answer, and it's a pretty surprising one, has everything to do with a special class of materials that are right at the heart of this huge industrial and geopolitical struggle.
To really get this, we have to go back to the early 2000s, because this was a crucial moment. The plastics industry didn't just grow, it basically split right down the middle into two completely separate worlds, each one heading down a very different path.
Okay, so on one side, you've got your everyday commodity plastics. Think polyethylene, PVC, the stuff that's everywhere. This became a game of huge volumes and razor-thin profit margins, and it was a game increasingly won by producers in Asia. So, in response, Western companies made a really strategic move. They retreated up the value chain. They pivoted to advanced polymers. These are specialty materials made in lower volumes, sure, but they come with much, much higher price tags and profits.
So faced with all this cutthroat competition on price, Western chemical companies decided not to play that game. Instead, they innovated. They pushed deep into the world of high-performance materials, and in doing so, they basically created a whole new class of superpolymers that could do things ordinary plastic couldn't even dream of. Now, if there's a superstar in this world, it's a polymer called PEEK. Just think of it as a super plastic that's so incredibly strong and resilient, it can actually replace metal in some of the most demanding, most extreme environments you can imagine. For engineers, this was a total game changer. And just how tough are we talking? PEEK holds onto its properties at temperatures up to 260 degrees Celsius. That's 500 degrees Fahrenheit. To put that in perspective, that is way beyond the melting point for most plastics you've ever come across. This incredible heat resistance is exactly what makes it so valuable.
So where do you actually find this stuff? Well, this is where it gets really cool. It's replacing titanium in spinal implants, and there's the answer to our opening question, and it's swapping out aluminum for lighter brackets in airplanes. These materials are also essential for building those enormous wind turbine blades and for making electric vehicles lighter, which makes them more efficient. The big takeaway here is that these aren't just plastics anymore. They've become absolutely strategic components of modern technology.
Let's talk money. Take another super material carbon fiber reinforced polymers. By 2024, the market for this stuff was already worth nearly $3 billion. What used to be a niche material for race cars and tennis rackets had officially become a major industrial sector. But here's the kicker. That's just the beginning. By 2030, that same market is projected to explode to over $10 billion. And this incredible demand is being driven straight from the green transition. The world needs lighter, stronger materials for things like wind turbines and EVs, and it needs them now.
Okay, so the West has this solid lead in high-tech polymers, right? Well, then something totally unexpected happened that completely flipped the script for the other side of the plastics world. You know, the commodity stuff that everyone thought the US had pretty much given up on. That something was the US shale gas boom. Thanks to fracking, the price of natural gas in America just plummeted. So while Europe and Asia were still stuck making plastics from expensive oil, American producers could suddenly make the exact same things from ridiculously cheap natural gas. It created this massive, unforeseen cost advantage for the US.
The result? A tidal wave of investment washed over the US Gulf Coast. Big players like Dow and ExxonMobil poured billions into building huge new plants, all with one single-minded goal: export all this new cheap plastic to the hungry markets over in Asia.
Now you have to imagine how this looked from China's perspective. As the world's biggest consumer of plastics, they saw this flood of cheap American imports not as a gift, but as a major strategic vulnerability. And their response was, well, it was swift, it was massive, and it was powerful.
By 2024, you could see that response in black and white on a global scale. The country was responsible for nearly half of all global investment in new chemical plants. Just let that sink in for a second. One country investing almost as much as the entire rest of the world combined. They weren't just building factories, they were building a chemical Great Wall. And this wasn't happening by accident. No, this was a deliberate national strategy. It's a core part of their Made in China 2025 initiative. Beijing set a very clear goal. We will achieve 70% self-sufficiency in core materials. The whole point was to end their reliance on imports and become a true industrial superpower.
So you've got these two giants on a collision course, right? You have the US leveraging the surprise cost advantage to pump out exports, and you have China building at a scale the world has literally never seen before to become self-sufficient. An industrial collision was pretty much inevitable.
And the result of these two colliding strategies is the reality we live in today: a structural, global oversupply of plastic. A flood of new Chinese capacity hit the market, and it absolutely crushed prices for commodity plastics. It's squeezing profits for producers everywhere, from Europe all the way to the United States.
Welcome to The Explainer. Today, we're going to break down the huge, kind of hidden forces that are completely reshaping the world of plastics. It's a story about how a massive shift in global investment, a total upending of the pricing rules, and some super smart machines are all coming together to remake the very stuff that builds our world.
Okay, let's just dive right in. This one image tells you the single biggest story in the industry today, where the money is going. In 2024, China's spending on new chemical plants makes up almost half of the entire global total. Just let that sink in for a second. For every single dollar being invested in this industry anywhere in the world, 50 cents of it is going to China. This is a massive, massive redistribution of industrial power.
But why this enormous investment? Well, to get that, you have to appreciate a really simple fact. For decades, our global appetite for plastics has been pretty much an unstoppable force. I mean, look at this growth curve. It's basically a straight line shooting upwards. It barely even flinched during global recessions or financial crises. So this relentless, you could say insatiable demand created the perfect environment for a huge shift in who makes, and therefore who controls, the world's plastics.
But the story of who funds all this production has radically changed. So let's follow that flow of capital, because it's happened in three really distinct phases, and it's all been moving from the west to the east.
This timeline really shows you just how fast that power shift happened. 30 years ago, back in the 90s, the world was, tripolar. Investment was pretty neatly balanced between North America, Western Europe, and Japan. But then in the 2010s, the whole map started to tilt, and it was thanks to a revolution happening right in the US.
That revolution was, of course, the American shale gas boom. It unlocked so much cheap raw material that it kicked off a staggering $200 billion investment spree on the Gulf Coast. And for a minute there, it really looked like the US was back on top. But that dominance, well, it was about to be completely eclipsed.
And that's because China's strategy right now is a total game changer. They aren't just building the same old factories. They're building these integrated mega refineries. These things are designed to take crude oil and convert it directly into chemicals, squeezing out every last drop of value for plastic production. It's fundamentally changing the old economic model.
And this brand new production model has absolutely shattered a core economic rule that governed the industry for 50 years: the link between the price of oil and the price of plastic.
Check this out. It shows you the breakdown of a simple rule that ran this industry for half a century. It used to be easy. If the price of oil went up, the price of plastic went up. They were basically chained together. Well, today, that chain is broken. And the reason is something called structural overcapacity, which is just a fancy way of saying there are now way more factories than the world needs, and they're all fighting for business.
And you can see this paradox happening in real time right now in 2024. Crude oil, the raw material, it's expensive, hovering around $70 to $80 a barrel. But the prices for common plastics like polypropylene and PVC are actually going down. How is that possible? It's that massive supply glut we just talked about. All those new Chinese plants are flooding the market, and the sheer volume of plastic is just crushing prices no matter what oil costs.
Okay, so the money has been totally transformed, the pricing has been totally transformed, but there's a third piece to this puzzle. At the exact same time all this economic stuff was happening, the machines themselves were going through an incredible evolution, from these clunky mechanical presses to truly clever, intelligent systems. I mean, this process has evolved so dramatically. It all started back in 1872 with what was basically a simple plunger press. It was slow, it was imprecise. The first really big leap came in the 40s with something called the reciprocating screw, a mechanism that could melt and inject plastic way faster and more evenly. That really paved the way for mass production. Then came the super precise, all-electric machines in the 80s, which were clean enough for medical parts. And now we're in the age of AI. Modern systems can now essentially see inside the mold while it's working. They use these tiny in-cavity sensors to monitor everything, and AI analyzes all that data on the fly, and the machine adjusts pressure and temperature literally millisecond by millisecond. And the result? A process so precise it's actually aiming for zero-defect production. Perfect parts every single time.
And a really similar evolution happened in extrusion. That's the process for creating continuous shapes like pipes or film. The key invention there was the twin-screw extruder, way back in the 1930s. The easiest way to think about it is like a high-tech pasta maker, with two interlocking screws that could perfectly mix additives into the plastic. This is what let us create custom compounds. Today's machines are just the powerful descendants of that idea, creating these incredibly new and complex plastic alloys. So, let's put it all together. The really crucial thing is to understand how these three transformations, the money, the price, and the machines, all add up to a completely new era for the entire global plastics industry.
So, to bring it all home, the money has decisively shifted east to China. The price of plastic is no longer tied to oil, and that's thanks to a massive oversupply that's making the raw materials cheaper than ever. And the machines, powered by AI and advanced sensors, are delivering a level of precision that we've just never seen before.
So what's the real-world result of all this? This isn't just academic theory, right? It's actually creating a whole new generation of materials. This combination of ultra-cheap raw materials and hyper-advanced machinery is exactly what allows us to engineer things like the complex conductive plastics that are essential for electric vehicle batteries, or those lightweight composites that make airplanes way more fuel efficient.
So this is really the central question we're tackling today. Because, the history of plastic, it's not just about chemistry class. It's a story of incredible innovation, of global wars, of fierce economic competition, and now a profound environmental challenge that's gonna shape the century ahead. So where do we even begin? Well, let's start at the very beginning. We're gonna rewind the clock and track how this man-made material first came into being and started its journey toward, global dominance. You can really think about the history of plastic in 3 big chapters. The first one starts way back in the 1860s. The goal then? To mimic nature, to replace things that were becoming scarce, like ivory for billiard balls. Then, fast forward to the mid-20th century, and it becomes a matter of military necessity. The world wars demanded new materials like synthetic rubber and nylon, and that just supercharged development. And finally, you have the post-war era, when plastics absolutely exploded into our daily lives, becoming the symbol of modern, affordable convenience. And the leap this industry has taken, it's just massive. I mean, look at the technology. We went from these crude, steam-heated plungers to the incredible precision of modern robotics. And the economics? It went from being this high-margin, patent-protected monopoly basically owned by the West to a hyper-competitive global market, where today, Asia is largely setting the price. Okay, so that's the history, but that brings us to the modern era. Let's shift our focus to the global stage, because today, this industry isn't just about making stuff. It has become a battleground for industrial policy between nations, and each one has its own unique playbook. To really get a handle on what's happening right now, you have to look at the 3 main players on the board: Germany, the United States, and China. Each country's history has totally shaped its approach, and today they're all playing very different games. First up, Germany. Its chemical industry, with giants like BASF and Bayer, was really forged out of the desperate necessity of 2 world wars.
That legacy then evolved into this post-war dominance in really high-performance, specialized plastics. Today, Germany's machine builders are the world leaders. They're basically exporting the picks and shovels of the plastic age to everybody else. Now, the US has a totally different story. Sure, it was built on corporate giants like DuPont and Dow, but the modern industry was truly forged by a massive government investment during World War II. I mean, an investment on a scale that's hard to even imagine. That legacy has now shifted. Today, the US is leveraging its shale gas boom to become a low-cost producer of basic plastics, things like polyethylene. $700 million. That's what the US government pumped into synthetic rubber during the war. In today's money, we're talking well over $10 billion. Let that sink in for a second. And the impact of that money was so huge that this program is still pointed to as the historical benchmark for successful state-sponsored industrial policy. That one single investment literally shaped the American chemical industry for decades to come. It just goes to show you what a defining role government can play. And that brings us to China. For decades, China was the world's workshop, the world's molder. They'd import the raw plastic and turn it into products. But that's changing, fast. Through big initiatives like Made in China 2025, it's transforming itself into the world's refiner. It's climbing up the value chain, making its own materials so it doesn't have to import them. And it's making a huge, aggressive push for leadership in green manufacturing. You know, China's push into green manufacturing is a perfect segue because it points to where this whole global competition is headed. The entire industry is now running headfirst into a new, unavoidable reality. It's entering its fourth, and maybe its most challenging, age, sustainability.
Okay, I want you to remember one number. Just one. 3 times.
So what does 3 times mean? Well, it means that if we just keep doing what we're doing, business as usual, global plastics production is on track to triple by the year 2060. The sheer scale of that increase presents an absolutely enormous challenge for waste, for resources, and for the environment.
So you might be thinking, what's the next big invention? What's the new miracle polymer? But here's the twist. The next great industrial evolution probably won't be about discovering a new kind of plastic. Instead, the focus is shifting to inventing new processes, things like advanced chemical recycling, and figuring out how to create a truly circular economy for the plastics we already have.
And what's so wild about this is how it brings our entire story full circle. This massive pivot that's happening right now, it's being driven by the exact same forces that created the industry in the first place, way back in the 1860s, a scarcity of resources and the absolute necessity of having to adapt.
Let's be honest, when you think of the oil industry, your mind probably jumps to cars, airplanes, power plants, fuel. And when you think of plastic, you probably think of packaging, bottles, all the stuff we use every day. They seem like totally separate worlds, right? Well, today we're going to pull back the curtain and see how these two industries aren't just related. They are completely, fundamentally, and economically intertwined. Okay, let's get into it.
And boom! This quote right here says it all, doesn't it? The plastic industry isn't just some side business for big oil. It's fast becoming its main reason for being. This is the core idea we're going to unpack today, exactly why plastic has become the fossil fuel industry's absolute lifeline, its critical plan B for the future.
So to really understand the money behind all this, we first have to get a handle on some super basic chemistry. Don't worry, it's pretty straightforward. Think of it like you're in a kitchen. The final dish, in this case plastic, is going to be totally different depending on the ingredients you start with and the recipe you follow.
And the most important ingredient in this kitchen has a specific name: feedstocks. This is the industry lingo for the raw materials, the basic hydrocarbon molecules that come from crude oil and natural gas and eventually get turned into plastics. And trust me, the cost and the availability of these feedstocks determine absolutely everything: where plastics get made, how much they cost, and who gets to dominate the global market.
Now this is where it gets really interesting because there are two main recipes. On the left, you've got light feedstocks, mostly ethane that comes from natural gas. This recipe is like a specialist. It's incredibly good at making ethylene, which is the main building block for polyethylene, the most common plastic on Earth. On the right, you have heavy feedstocks like naphtha, which you get from crude oil. This has been the classic recipe for Europe and Asia. It's more of a generalist. It makes ethylene, but also a whole bunch of other valuable chemicals. For decades, the world was kind of neatly divided along these two lines. And then, everything changed.
Yeah, that neat division, it didn't last. In the 21st century, a huge disruption came along and completely redrew the global plastics map, creating what the industry now calls the American ethane advantage.
The absolute game changer was the US shale revolution. Fracking unlocked these just massive amounts of natural gas. And with all that gas came a tidal wave of ethane. Remember, that key ingredient for plastic. It was so cheap and so abundant, producers literally didn't know what to do with it. In some places, they were just burning it off at the wellhead because there was no way to transport or store it all.
And this chart just brilliantly illustrates the economic earthquake that followed. I mean, look at these numbers from September 2012. In the US, using that crazy cheap ethane, it cost just 6 cents to produce a pound of ethylene. 6 cents. At the same time, in Europe and Asia, using their traditional oil-based recipe, it cost $1.37. That's not just a little competitive edge. That is a complete demolition of the old way of doing things.
This five-fold difference wasn't just a blip on the radar. It was a fundamental shift. It basically kicked off a modern gold rush. You had chemical giants from all over the world pouring billions of dollars into building huge new facilities. They call them crackers, all along the US Gulf Coast. And in just a few years, the United States went from being a net importer of plastics to a dominant global exporter. A total flip. But what does all this integration actually look like on the ground? Let's zoom in from the abstract global market and take a little tour inside a real-life petroplastic city.
Welcome to the ExxonMobil complex in Baytown, Texas. This place is enormous. We're talking 3,400 acres, and it's where the line between an oil company and a plastics manufacturer just completely vanishes. It's all one seamless flow. First, the refinery processes the oil and gas. Then, a plant right next door cracks those molecules into about 10 billion pounds of chemicals every year. And finally, another plant right there on site synthesizes those chemicals into plastics like polyethylene for your packaging and polypropylene for car parts. It's one giant integrated system.
And all of this leads us to the final and frankly the most important part of this whole story. This deep integration isn't just about being efficient. It's a deliberate, strategic pivot for the entire future of the fossil fuel industry. This chart from the International Energy Agency is staggering. It shows where the growth in oil demand is projected to come from by 2050. And just look at that biggest slice. Nearly half of all the growth in oil demand isn't for burning in cars, planes, or ships. It's for petrochemicals. It's for making stuff. The message here is loud and clear. The future of oil isn't fuel, it's plastic. And this whole thing creates a fascinating paradox. As the world tries to decarbonize by moving away from burning fossil fuels for energy, we are at the same time becoming even more dependent on those very same fossil fuels as physical materials. We're basically shifting our use from releasing carbon into the atmosphere to locking it up in solid form as plastic. And with billions invested in these massive industrial complexes, that demand is locked in for decades to come.
You know, plastic is everywhere, right? It's so common we just don't even see it anymore. But what if it's more than that? What if it wasn't just a replacement for, say, glass or metal? What if this one material completely re-engineered our entire way of life? It sounds dramatic, I know, but let's really get into it.
Right, that's the core idea here. Plastic didn't just replace stuff. It enabled entirely new forms of living. Think about it. It totally changed how hospitals work, how we store food in our kitchens, even the social lives of our grandparents. It's this wild story of innovation. But yeah, it came with consequences we're still dealing with today. And really, the best place to see this in action is in healthcare. The move from reusable tools to single-use plastic ones, it wasn't just a small change. It was a complete revolution in sterility. So, picture this. Before the 1950s, a syringe wasn't something you just tossed in a bin. No way. It was this beautifully crafted, expensive tool made of glass and metal. It was a valuable piece of equipment, and after every single injection, it had to be meticulously and riskily cleaned. And meticulously is putting it lightly. You had to take it apart, clean every little piece, sharpen the needle by hand, and then boil the whole thing to sterilize it. It was so much work for the nurses and staff. And more importantly, every single one of those steps was a chance for something to go wrong. A tiny mistake could mean cross-contamination, spreading diseases like hepatitis, a huge, constant risk.
And then, things changed fast. It all kind of came together at once. You have Jonas Salk's massive polio vaccine program in '54, which proved that a disposable model could work on a huge scale. Just 2 years later, this pharmacist in New Zealand, Colin Murdoch, he patents the disposable plastic syringe. And boom, by 1961, the Plastipack hits the market, and that's it. The industry standard was set. The old way was gone, just like that. So let's just pause and think about that leap.
We went from a complex, high-risk system that was a huge burden on hospital staff to a simple, pre-sterilized, single-use system that basically wiped out patient-to-patient infection from reused needles. I mean, this single innovation saved an unbelievable number of lives. It's hard to even quantify.
Okay, so that's the hospital, a huge life-saving change. But at the very same time, this plastic revolution was also happening somewhere else, much more quietly. It was reshaping the American home, specifically the kitchen, and it changed the social fabric for millions of women. And it all centered on one iconic product.
Yup, Tupperware. Now the material itself was pretty cool. Polyethylene, a waste product from oil refining. But the real magic, the thing that made it a must-have, was that famous airtight seal. You'd burp it to get the air out. In a time when refrigerators weren't what they are today, this was a total game changer for keeping leftovers fresh.
But honestly, the container itself isn't the whole story. Not even close. The real revolution was social. See, this brilliant sales executive, Brownie Wise, she figured out you couldn't just stick this stuff on a store shelf. People didn't get it. You had to show them how it worked. And that's how the Tupperware party was born. It tapped into women's social circles in this completely new and powerful way. And this is where it gets really interesting, because it was a total double-edged sword. On the one hand, it was incredibly empowering. I mean, think about it. For a woman in the 1950s, this was a legitimate way to earn her own money, to run her own business, all from her living room. But on the other hand, it also kind of doubled down on the idea that a woman's place was in the home, right? It turned friendships into sales opportunities and centered her work around the kitchen.
And if you want to know just how huge this was, get this. In 1954, Brownie Wise became the very first woman ever to be on the cover of Business Week. That's how big of a deal she was. She was a powerhouse.
So we've seen plastic change the hospital and the home, but all of this was part of a much bigger shift in thinking. The move away from repairing and reusing things towards a culture of just throwing stuff away. That didn't just happen by accident. It was designed. It was engineered. And this quote right here, it says it all. It's from this famous 1955 article in Life magazine called Throwaway Living. The whole point of the article was to sell this new idea. The idea that disposability wasn't lazy or wasteful. No, it was modern. It was liberating for the housewife. The good old milk bottle is a perfect example of this. Remember the milkman leaving glass bottles on the porch? Well, for the dairy, that system was a headache. The bottles were heavy, they broke, they were expensive to ship, and then they had to get them all back, wash them, and refill them. The plastic jug? It's light, it's cheap, and here's the genius part from their perspective. Once you buy it, it's your problem. The responsibility for disposal was shifted entirely from the company to the customer. And then came the PET bottle in the 70s. That was really the final nail in the coffin for the old way. It was shatterproof, super lightweight, and it made things like the giant 2-liter soda bottle possible. You just couldn't do that safely with glass. By the time the 80s rolled around, single-use plastic wasn't just an option, it was the king. Okay, so after that whirlwind tour, where does that leave us today? What's the legacy of this plastic revolution that happened so fast? Well, it really boils down to a massive trade-off, doesn't it? On one side, we got incredible benefits. In medicine, we gained near-perfect sterility that saved countless lives. But the price was a huge new stream of medical waste. In our daily lives, we gained this amazing convenience, but the price was a throwaway culture that completely devalued durability and reuse. You know, we think we know the story of plastic. It's this useful thing we invented that, oops, turned into a terrible pollutant. But what if I told you that's not even half the story? The real journey of plastic is this wild cultural roller coaster ride from a utopian dream to, well, a dystopian nightmare. So let's dive into the incredible twists and turns of how this one material totally captured our imagination. So right here, you've got the two faces of plastic. On one side, you have the dream, right? This magical stuff that promised a bright, shiny future full of infinite possibilities. And then you have the other side, the nightmare we're kind of living in now, where it's a symbol of environmental decay, of a toxic, artificial world. The big question is, how on earth did we get from one to the other in just a couple of decades? To answer that, we've got to go back to the mid-20th century. This was an age of just incredible optimism, where plastic wasn't just another material, it was a promise. It was the promise of infinite transformation.
And you know what's wild? How thinkers at the time saw plastic. In 1957, the French philosopher Roland Barthes wrote this line, And he didn't mean it as a warning. He was in total awe. To him, plastic was like a modern-day miracle, an alchemical substance that could literally reshape the entire world in its image.
Okay, so to really get what Barth was on about, you need to know a little bit about his field, semiotics. It's basically the study of how things become symbols, how they get their meaning. And for Barths, plastic wasn't just a physical thing, it was this hugely powerful symbol of modernity itself.
This really breaks down his big idea. So think about traditional stuff like wood or metal. They have a history, right? And an essence. But plastic? Barths called it a disgraced material. Why? Because it had no past, no history. Its entire identity was its endless potential to be turned into something else. It was pure function over substance. He didn't even see it as a finished thing, but as the trace of a movement. It was like physical proof that modern industry could take a pile of sludge and turn it into literally anything you could imagine.
But of course, that utopian dream, it wasn't built to last. Just 10 years later, the cracks were really starting to show. As we move into the late 1960s, you're going to see how this miracle material started to become a symbol of a phony, totally manufactured future.
And then came this one line from this one movie that changed everything. It's this piece of career advice given to the main character, Benjamin Braddock. And with that single word, plastics, a massive cultural battle line was drawn in the sand.
And what you see here is this huge generational divide just splitting wide open. For Mr. McGuire's generation, plastics was a word just full of promise, a booming industry, economic security, progress. But for Benjamin and the whole 60s counterculture, it was a dirty word. It represented everything they were rejecting: conformity, consumerism, a phony, superficial, and totally soulless world. A future that was, secure, but spiritually bankrupt. And just like that, in the span of a single decade, the word plastic went from being this incredible symbol of possibility to just a flat-out insult. To call someone plastic meant they were fake. The cultural meaning had done a complete 180.
So as we roll into the 1970s, this cultural anxiety, it starts to get a whole lot darker. The fear wasn't just about a phony lifestyle anymore. It was about realizing that we'd built a world so dependent on plastic that it was becoming dangerously fragile.
Which leads to this terrifying question. What if the phoniness of plastic wasn't just a social critique anymore? What if it became a literal physical danger? Well, that's the horrifying idea behind this 1971 novel called Mutant 59: The Plastic Eaters. The plot is just, wow. It's absolutely chilling. A microbe that eats plastic gets unleashed in London. But here's the twist. It doesn't attack people. It attacks the very fabric of their world. Insulation on wires melts, gas pipes dissolve, and up in the sky, entire airplanes literally start to liquefy. It's this engineered apocalypse that shows in the most brutal way possible how completely dependent our civilization had become on this one material. All right, let's jump forward to the 1980s. This is when a new genre comes along and takes all this plastic anxiety and twists it into this gritty, high-tech aesthetic. Welcome to the world of cyberpunk. The author William Gibson just nails the vibe with the opening line from his novel Neuromancer. In this cyberpunk future, there's no clear line between what's natural and what's artificial. The sky itself looks synthetic. Gibson's world wasn't just described as plastic. You can practically feel it. His stories are filled with these synthetic surfaces, crumpled plastic litter everywhere, even cheap plastic body parts. The characters are modifying themselves with prosthetics and carbon sockets, literally merging their bodies with the material.
And this is where it gets really unsettling. This is the big evolution in the cyberpunk vision. Plastic is no longer just for making things you own. It's become a part of us, fusing with our bodies and just dissolving the very boundary between what's born and what's manufactured.
So while cyberpunk was imagining this future where we became plastic, reality, well, it took a different and maybe even more insidious path. And that brings us to today, to our modern era, where the story has taken its most alarming turn yet. The fear is no longer about social phoniness or society collapsing, it's about a quiet, invisible contamination.
This is the crucial thing for us today. The whole conversation has shifted. For decades, the problem of plastic was what we could see, right? Bags, bottles, all that litter. Now, the biggest threat is what we can't see.
And look, this didn't happen overnight.
Scientists were finding these little plastic pellets in the ocean way back in the 70s, but it took until 2004 for the term microplastics to even exist. But the real, massive turning point, that came in 2017 with the BBC's Blue Planet 2 and those absolutely heart-wrenching images of albatrosses feeding plastic to their starving chicks without even knowing.
That moment right there kicked off what we now call the Blue Planet effect. Public outrage just exploded. Governments were pressured into action, banning single-use items. This was the final nail in the coffin for that old miracle material story. And it was the beginning of our current story, the toxicant narrative, where plastic is this invisible poison that's infiltrated our entire world. We're talking about those tiny fragments from our clothes and tires, the particles that break down from bigger waste. They've been found everywhere, from Mount Everest to the Mariana Trench, in our water, in our food, and yes, even inside our own bodies.
You know, we all think we know the story of plastic, right? It's the classic tale, a 20th century miracle that became a 21st century menace. But what if I told you that familiar story, the one all about waste and disposability, is only half the picture? Yeah, that story is about to get a very surprising high-tech update.
I mean, remember this line from The Graduate? That one single word, plastics, just perfectly captured a moment in time. It became this symbol for everything phony, mass-produced, and throwaway. It felt like the very texture of our environmental problems. And for a long, long time, it seemed like that's where the story was going to end.
But here's the thing. Before plastic was the villain, it was actually the hero of the story. And to really understand where it's going, we gotta first understand where it's been.
The journey of plastic's reputation is just dramatic. It really did start out like some kind of alchemical dream, letting us create things without having to use scarce stuff like ivory or tortoiseshell. Then you get to the mid-century, and boom, it's this domestic liberator, giving us everything from Tupperware to life-saving disposable syringes. But then, the very things that made it so great, how incredibly cheap it was, how easy it was to just throw away, well, that's what turned it into the cultural villain we all know today.
And that brings us right up to the present. This is where the story gets really, really interesting. Because the plastic age, it isn't ending. No way. It's doing something much weirder. It's splitting in two.
Think of it like two parallel universes, both happening at the same time. On one side, you've got your commodity plastics. That's all the packaging, the single-use items we see everywhere. And their future? Well, it's a massive struggle to manage this giant waste crisis and move away from fossil fuels. But on the other side, there's a completely different story playing out with something called advanced composites. Here, the goal isn't disposability at all. It's the exact opposite: extreme durability, permanence. This is the high-tech, fast-forward version of plastic.
And the star of this high-tech story is a material you've definitely heard of, but you might not even realize is a type of plastic. Let's meet carbon fiber.
So what is this stuff exactly? Its full name is Carbon Fiber Reinforced Polymer, or CFRP for short. And the basic idea is you take these unbelievably strong, super thin strands of almost pure carbon, and you embed them in a polymer matrix, usually a resin like epoxy. You can almost think of it like a kind of super-powered papier-mâché. The whole point here isn't to be cheap and disposable. It's to achieve unbelievable levels of performance.
And when I say performance, I'm not kidding. Check this out. By weight, CFRP can be up to 10 times stronger than steel. And at the same time, it's only 1/5 the weight. So it's lighter than aluminum, but way, way stronger. That combination of properties is an absolute game changer. It just opens up a whole new world of engineering possibilities.
How they make it is pretty fascinating too. It starts with these precursor fibers that get superheated until almost nothing is left but carbon atoms. These new fibers are as thin as a hair. They get woven into a fabric, kind of like a high-tech piece of cloth. And then finally, that fabric gets infused with a polymer resin, it's put into a mold, and it's cured into a solid, ultra-light, and ultra-strong part.
Okay, so it's strong and it's light. Big deal, right? Well, yeah, it's a huge deal, because this advanced form of plastic is quietly becoming the essential backbone of the green economy. Let's take a look at how.
Let's start with a really tough engineering challenge. If we want hydrogen to be a real fuel for cars, you have to store it under immense pressure. We're talking around 10,000 psi. That's basically the same pressure you'd find at the bottom of the deep ocean. So how in the world do you safely contain that in a vehicle that's driving down the highway?
The answer is the Type 4 hydrogen tank, and it is only possible because of CFRP. Inside, a simple polymer liner holds the gas, but the real workhorse is a thick outer shell of carbon fiber that's wound around it over and over.
You can't use metals. They're just way too heavy, and they can actually get brittle and fail when they're exposed to hydrogen. So the takeaway here is crucial. Without these advanced plastics, the hydrogen economy is, well, physically impossible.
And just to put a finer point on it, get this. It takes 10 kilograms of carbon fiber just to safely store a single kilogram of hydrogen. That's the ratio. That's how fundamental this material is to the whole energy transition.
Next up, let's look at the future of getting around cities. Electric vertical takeoff and landing aircraft. You know, eVTOLs. Basically, flying cars. And they are also completely dependent on advanced composites. So a leader in this space is a company called Joby Aviation. Their biggest challenge is that batteries are incredibly heavy compared to jet fuel. So to make up for that and get any kind of useful range, the body of the aircraft, the airframe, has to be exceptionally light. The solution? An airframe made almost entirely out of carbon fiber. Every single gram they can save by using it translates directly into more range or more passengers.
Okay, for our last application, let's come back down to Earth. Because the very same material that's making flying cars a reality is also solving a much more grounded problem, our crumbling bridges.
So the classic way we reinforce a concrete bridge is with steel bars, right? Rebar. But there's a huge problem. When steel gets exposed to water and de-icing salts, it rusts. And when it rusts, it expands, and it literally cracks the concrete open from the inside out. Carbon fiber, on the other hand, does not corrode, ever. Bridges built with CFRP reinforcement, like one that went up in Michigan way back in 2001, have a theoretical lifespan of over 100 years with a lot less maintenance.
And here's what's truly incredible. CFRP isn't just for building new things. If a bridge girder gets damaged, say a truck hits it, it can be repaired by just wrapping it in carbon fiber. And often, that repair makes the beam stronger than it was before it was ever damaged. It's an amazing way to affordably rescue and upgrade the infrastructure we already have.
So, where does all this leave us? We've basically seen two completely different worlds, both existing under that one simple name, plastics.
And these are the two futures of the plastic age, and they're happening right now at the same time. On one path, you have the single-use struggle. That's the massive global effort to deal with the legacy of our cheap, throwaway economy. But on the other path, you've got this high-tech acceleration, where we're using advanced polymers to build permanent things, hydrogen tanks, electric aircraft, 100-year bridges that are absolutely essential for building a sustainable world.
So, the crucial takeaway is this: plastic isn't a single thing with a single destiny anymore. That one word from The Graduate is still the key to the future, but its meaning has become infinitely more complex. So the next time we talk about the future of plastic, maybe the most important question we can ask is, which one?